I'm Sarah Jackson, host of Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, a listening experience choreographed to help you elevate your internal communications to the pro level.
If you really want to touch people's heart and get them to buy into whatever message that you're delivering, you have to remind them about the why. When a pandemic hits, the words from an executive such as, "My office is always open," or "My door is always open," or "Call me anytime," really take on greater meaning. We wanted to make sure that we didn't sugarcoat anything. It was important that the messages included an acknowledgement that the employees were possibly going through a difficult time, and showing empathy regarding their situation.
That's Michael Hughes, Public Affairs Specialist for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Michael also worked for the National Transportation Safety Board, and today we are tapping into his experience in Washington, D.C. while working with our nation's leaders. As you know, we are still in the thick of our global pandemic, and it is now more important than ever to have transparency be felt from your leadership to your employees. But how do you coach your executives in a way that will resonate with them and manifest into clear, empathetic, yet informative communications? Well, today Michael gives us his 4-pillar communication formula he uses to empower leadership with transparent communication for frontline workers. But Michael didn't start in DC. Let's jump in to hear where Michael's love for internal communications began.
I've always loved communications, and at the first part of my career, I was mostly dealing with media and external communications. I went to school at the University of Maryland for journalism, and I had dreams of being a television reporter, a TV star, right? I always enjoyed communicating and telling stories. And I went to school for journalism, and then I got my first job in Charleston, South Carolina upon graduating in 2002 as a general assignment news reporter. And for your listeners, everyone knows what that is. I basically was, had a microphone, and I was doing local news and, interviewing police officers and government officials and doing that. And I really enjoyed that. To this day, Sarah, it was probably my most exciting job because every day you get an opportunity to tell a story, tell somebody else's story, and really share that with potentially hundreds of thousands of people. So I did that for 3 years, and upon my contract expiring, I ended up in the hospitality industry for 10 years. And then I got out of the hospitality industry after that, and I ended up working in federal service in my first internal communications job at the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, the agency that investigates plane crashes and transportation accidents, serving as a internal communication liaison for the chairman of the board. And I recently transitioned, as mentioned, into public affairs with another federal agency.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about. I always love asking about last year, and everyone loves to swap stories because so many of our stories were just so unique. Give us insight to your year. I'm sure you're remote, probably working from home. Give us a little insight about what that was like.
Yeah, it was quite a year, and that's an understatement. For us, it was a year of transition. So at the beginning of the year, January, February was just like any year. We had our sort of our editorial calendar set. We had our normal events that we would do every quarter, different touch points that the leadership would have with the employees, and it was all good. But of course, March, we really had to adjust and sort of modify how we were going to do things. Starting in mid-March, 100% of the employees started working remotely. And that meant we had to really get up in terms of the technology that we had available to us. So right around March, we started using Microsoft Teams and Skype for government, and really doing our jobs from home 100%. And that meant everything from obviously, email, video conferencing, and even some of the regular programs that we were producing specific to internal comms were being done remotely. It was a challenge, but fortunately, I was in a position where I had the opportunity to help some of our leadership and employees kind of make that adjustment.
Hmm. Well, and I know in our prep call, you talked about kind of this struggle to not only keep connections with frontline workers, but also to enhance transparency, with leadership. And so, I want to get into this today. Talk to me about what was that struggle to keep connection among frontline workers. Tell me about that.
Yeah, one of the things that we identified very early in the pandemic was that our leadership at the agency that I was at had to really do four things really well when the pandemic hit in terms of internal communication. The information coming from leadership had to be informative, honest, timely, and personal, Sarah. So we made sure that we wanted to make sure we had regular connection to let employees know everything about what the plan was for coming back to the office, if that was the case. What were expectations in terms of getting your work done? What were some of the questions, providing answers to the questions that people had regarding coming back to the office? And we wanted to make sure that any of the messages that came down from leadership really fit in those four categories that I mentioned, being informative, honest, timely, and personal. And we can talk a little bit about that as we go along.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And I love that anytime we can give our listeners a list, a template, a checklist, we love that. So informative, honest, timely, and personal. That's so good. And talk to me, what did that look like when we're now in this new normal of remote work? I think that's such a key tip, and it seems so common and obvious, but to reestablish the expectations of what that was like. How did you do that, and some of the tactical ways?
Sure. So one of the things that we had prior to the pandemic at the NTSB is that our top executive, our chairman of the board, had quarterly programs called Chat with the Chairman, in which all the employees would be able to virtually have a moderated conversation with the chairman based on an established theme and also any questions that people had. So we already had a vehicle in place where there was what I consider good communication flow between the decision makers at our agency and the frontline employees. But when the pandemic hit, we realized that employees needed something more than just a quarterly update of conversation. So what we did was we put in place a system where every 3 weeks, at the minimum, the top executive would come out with a sort of a video presentation that would be delivered live to an audience. And when we talk about those four tenets that I mentioned, Sarah, about informative, the updates had to be informative in the sense that when people look to executives to give them information, they want solid information. What are the requirements for me coming to the office? What does my supervisor expect of me? If I'm not comfortable going to the office because of a threat of some sort of disease, what are the rules and regulations and policies and protocols that are now being put in place? So it had to be informative in the sense that it had to be substantive. These updates weren't just, hey, how's everybody feeling? And hey, did you see the football game? And they couldn't be of a casual nature. They have to be based on solid information that people needed to get their jobs done. And Sarah, the second tenet we wanted to make sure that these communications had, that they were honest. One of the things that we had talked about, Herb Kelly, which is the CEO of Southwest Airlines, had also put out some regular updates that we kind of drew some inspiration from. We wanted to make sure that we didn't sugarcoat anything. In terms of the government is concerned, we weren't going to be laying off people because of the pandemic, because government works a little differently than private industry. But we wanted to let people know if we didn't have certain answers. In a lot of cases, a lot of people wanted to know, hey, when is the pandemic going to end and when can we go back to the office? In a lot of cases, we didn't have those answers, but we had to be honest with people and let them know, that's a great question. We don't have that information, but as soon as we know, we will let you know. We had to be careful not to try to, make something up or overpromise or overpredict something that we didn't know. We had to be honest in terms of, and transparent based on what we did know and information that was solid. The two final tenets or sort of principles of our communications every time we put them out from the executive team, where they had to be timely and personal. Timely in the sense is that we couldn't wait too long. Every 3 weeks, we're going to have some sort of update. And if there was some situation that precipitated that we needed to get it out sooner, then we would. For instance, if there was a high profile accident that we needed to inform our employees about, or certain things going on within the organization that were more urgent in nature, we didn't wait for the 3 weeks to come around. We went ahead and created a video or an update as appropriate. And then that final thing was personal. Um, Employees appreciate it when they do have information, but it was important, I thought, and this was my advice to the executive team and the chairman, is that he kind of let them know that um, we care about their situation. We know that ultimately the difference between work and your family is what you really rely on to care for you in times of need. And your employer, obviously, you have a professional relationship with, but it was important that the messages included um, an acknowledgement that the employees were possibly going through a difficult time, um, and showing empathy regarding their situation. And that was also key in order for the employees to really, I think, benefit from the messages fully.
The Internal Comms Pro Collective is proudly supported by Circle Broadcast. Now, you know how Michael's talking about virtual events like Chat with the Chairman. Well, if you're searching for a way to send your leadership communications where your frontline employees already are, Circle Broadcast allows your teams to send targeted, time-sensitive executive communications and deliver them on each employee's preferred channel. Instead of your CEO's message getting buried in your employees' inboxes, send them to their mobile app. You can have it up and running with a flip of a switch. You heard that right, there's no need to knock on IT's door for another integration. If you're looking for a unified, cross-channel approach, Broadcast is the solution for you. Head on over to circle.com/ICP to learn more. That's CERKL.com/ICP. Now, in this next part, Michael shares how to reconnect your employees with the mission of their organization and how to keep them grounded in times of crisis. He also talks about the importance of word choice and language during a time of crisis, and we learn how the pandemic propelled him to step into a key leadership role to be a conduit between the employees and the executive team, and to make sure that folks' concerns were being heard and understood. Hey, he gives this great idea on the mechanism he created to field employees' concerns. Now let's jump back in. I love this high-level strategy so much because I can see myself, I can see our listeners now being able to go into their leadership and saying, okay, you need to do these 4 things. And so I appreciate you sharing your sort of buckets with us. Anything else from a high-level strategy to enhance that transparency?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, in addition to those 4 tenets, we always wanted to make sure people were reminded of the mission. And I think that anybody who works with internal communications, if you really want to touch people's heart and get them to buy into whatever message that you're delivering, you have to remind them about the why. There's a lot of smart people within the federal government, within the realm in which I work. Um, but you really have to go back to why are we doing the work that we're doing? Because how we're doing it might shift. But in terms of the NTSB at the time that I was working, our mission was to save lives, was to prevent future transportation accidents from happening. And there's really no higher calling in life, no matter what you're doing, is if what you're doing is going to save lives or improve people's lives. So even though instead of going and having a meeting down the hall, we were going to be sending an email or having a conversation on the phone, we would be having a video chat. There's going to be lots of things that were changing. We always wanted to remind people that even though how we're doing it will change, why we're doing it is consistent. And that may sound a little cheesy, but we really found that people bought into that and it helped keep folks grounded.
Yeah. So, did those 4 buckets, were they born out of maybe a mistake or confusion that was happening? Or did you have a mistake happened when you did launch these four tenants? I always want to, this, it sounds like you're doing this so well, but I always like to dive a little bit deeper and ask, okay, tell us about the screw ups because we know that, that's where all the learning comes from. So if you're allowed to share, if you can't, we totally get it. This is the good news channel, we tell folks. But is there something that you can say, all right, here's what really happened, but out of that, this is what we learned?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I mean, you kind of draw on strengths and principles and things that have worked well from the past, but you can also learn from missteps. There was a situation that happened within the NTSB maybe 4 years ago. So there had been a train accident or a smoke incident on WMATA, which is the Washington Area Metro Transit Authority. And during the public board meeting, our chairman made a statement um, that the leadership at the WMATA needed to change, that there was a critical defect in the way WMATA was handling their safety procedures. And the language that he used was that WMATA had a learning disability, right? And he was quoting from a book that he had read, talking about dysfunctional organizations and how when a dysfunctional organization doesn't have strong leadership and they're not going in the right direction, it's as sad as learning disabilities in children. So anyway, Sarah, he borrowed sort of that sort of scenario and applied it to what he had described as a dysfunctional leadership at WMATA. And although we thought it was a strong point because he was making a point of how the organization that we were, investing this accident about really needed to change, the media jumped on it and basically had said that the NTSB chairman calls out this organization, comparing it to disabilities in children. And so what did the front page of the newspaper say, right? The front page of the Washington Post the next day says, NTSB likens dysfunctional organization to, child disabilities. And then we got all sorts of letters from the National Association of, Disabled Children and all the, things that happen after that. So I guess what I'm saying is that just because you have an idea and you want to kind of craft communications in a certain way that you think are going to be effective, you really have to step back and think about how it's going to affect your audience. And that was a lesson that we had a couple of years ago that we really made a strong point. And as an organization, we were really trying to propel this organization to make the changes that they need so that safety measures could be applied and lives could be saved. But the way that we expressed ourselves ended up being interpreted as if we were being insensitive to a portion of the population which had disabilities, which wasn't the case. So before approaching this situation where every single one of our employees were going to be affected, we really took time to figure out what we were going to say and how it could be, construed and digested among our audience to make sure that it was coming across the way we really wanted it to be.
And those mistakes, I think, give, you, the internal communicator, I think, such wisdom. And now you're able to guide leadership because you've learned, and now you're looking at the communication from, again, from an empathy lens, from all the different potential audience members and the angle. With that, did you find yourself, being in roles like that to say, oh, we might not want to say this? Did you find that COVID and the last year thrusted you more in a visual, more leadership role? Tell me about that for you personally.
Yeah, it did, because in my role in the executive office as the internal communication liaison for the chairman, um, a lot of what I did was sort of manage programs and make sure that our employees had necessary access to the leadership within the organization so that they can feel like their concerns were being heard, and that things that they needed to be, that they wanted addressed on an organizational level, even within an department level, were being addressed. When a pandemic hits, the words from an executive such as, my office is always open, or my door is always open, or call me anytime, really take on greater meaning. And I found myself in a position where I really had to triage a lot of the requests that would come into the front office because people had questions about when they could come back to the office. They had questions about expectations about their work or procedures or the direction the agency was going in. Would deadlines be extended for certain work products that were being produced because of the lack of people's ability to collaborate in the normal ways that they had been? So I really had to step up into a role and make sure that I was that conduit between the employees and the executive team and make sure that folks' concerns were being heard and understood and then responded properly. And one of the things that I feel that as an internal communicator, in addition to, you know, whether you help publish a website or a newsletter or produce a program that connects, leadership with the employees, I think one of the keys is making sure that as questions come up, if there are questions that come up in real time that can't be answered, remember that was the whole line of being honest, right? Not just trying to put out an answer. Follow up is really important. And we had a mechanism that during a live event where the chairman was giving information about where the agency was going or addressing certain questions, if there was a situation which could not be answered in real time, we had a mechanism in place where that question would be documented and then would be triaged to the necessary subject matter expert. So that could be, but it was up to me to make sure that that person who asked the question within 3 days got a response. So I did find myself taking a greater role in making sure that folks weren't just being fed information, but that they were getting specific responses and answers to questions that they had.
That is so good. Well, and that what a great tip to make sure that you make time to create that mechanism, whether it be just your good old notebook or if you've got some, kind of fancy tool or tech to get that done and facilitate that, and maybe in an automated way. That's such a great tip. I love that.
Yeah, yeah. We use Microsoft Outlook, which is just an email, a little
Yeah.
notepad, and then Microsoft Output to get the emails out. Exactly.
There you go. So, did you find that there was increased need for tools or resources or technology to keep the connection with those frontline workers? And if so, how did you get the budget to get it done?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we were really fortunate. What we found that it wasn't necessarily a need to create tools that we hadn't had before. Sarah, we had to get people to use existing tools that were already in place, which weren't really being utilized to the full. For instance, we had developed recently, this was in late 2019, a few months before the pandemic hit, an internal website that showcased different departments and area of the organization that people might not be aware of. There was also sort of an employee spotlight section where different individuals would be highlighted not only for the work that they do in the organization, but outside the organization. There was a point where employees could send in comments that would be addressed by leadership. And we found, just like any tool that's out there, usage was moderate. Right, it was kind of high at first when it first came out, and then people kind of get used to seeing it on their desktop, and they don't use it as much. We also in the NTSB we're using the suite of Microsoft tools. Right, Microsoft Teams is a very common sort of video conference tool that wasn't being utilized as much because the need wasn't there. So what we found, instead of spending money or trying to quickly develop new tools, we really focused on helping people learn and get comfortable with the existing tools that we had, using the website as a way of getting information if you wanted to find out what's going on, using and getting comfortable with Microsoft Teams if you wanted a face-to-face, quote unquote, a virtual meeting, and you wanted to see somebody. So that's what we really kind of leveraged, is really getting people comfortable and educated on using existing tools instead of creating new ones out of the need.
Yeah, that's so good because you want to be able to, we hear we're going to be doing another episode on how do you pull people instead of pushing them, to certain things. And so I think your message here and really teaching your audience this is what these channels are for and to, so they know where to go, when and how to get it. I think that is such a great tip and one that might be forgotten that they just need to be reminded and taught where to go to get the information. So good. So, as you're heading into 2021, what are you thinking about for your strategy, and what might be a blind spot that maybe you could warn us about as we head into this new normal?
Yeah, and it's funny that that term "new normal" is this is how we do business, right? Everything is virtual. No one's meeting at the brick and mortar anymore, at least in my environment. I'm at an agency right now that is also 100% telework, um, and we're going to continue that way. It's going to be, it's hard to say business as usual because a year ago things were operating in a different way, um, but just from my perspective for 2021, it needed to be a focus from an executive standpoint of really making sure that they're connecting with their employees in that virtual manner, in a regular manner. In order for success to happen in 2021, those decision making roles within organizations, those executives, those influencers really need to make sure that their communications are informative, honest, timely, and personal. Those are the four tenets, no matter where you are. It worked last year at the agency that I was, and everywhere I go, executives who embrace those tenets, those principles, will continue to make sure that those their employees are informed and engaged and ultimately productive.
Hmm. Now, I people know me. I like to get down into the weeds of some of this stuff. So, how does that look day to day? If you are virtual, do you call up each one of the leaders and say, "Okay, what are we going to be talking about this quarter?" Like, how do you execute that? Do you have a master plan that these things go in? How does it work in your world?
In my particular world, it's not necessarily an everyday thing, but at the organization that I'm at now, the government agency that I'm at now, every month there's an all hands touch point with our top executive. And what she does is she has these meetings and informs the entire organization about the things that are important. Here are our goals at the beginning of the year. Here's the progress, and let me hear from you. And then beyond the all hands meetings, as we call them, there are also divisional meetings that happen within a month where people can talk specifically about the work that they're doing, the challenges that they're having, the kudos that they want to share, right? So I think what that looks like on a daily-to-day basis or on a week-to-week basis, that there are opportunities that employees have to not only reach out to your direct supervisor, but also heads of organizations on a regular basis, whether it's biweekly or monthly or even quarterly, to be able to communicate.
That is so good, especially when you're talking about different strategies to keep that connection, with those frontline workers. So, if you could go back in time to your younger self, would there be a warning or a lesson you would give yourself in embarking on this crazy world of internal comms, particularly during a pandemic?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? And as communicators, one of the principles of being a good communicator is you've got to prepare now for what you don't might not know what happens in the future, right? You really got to be prepared. Um, to my younger self, I would just say continue to be grounded in the principles of communication and collaboration. Be true to your principles. What got you the success a year ago is going to continue to be the bedrock for which breeds success in the future.
So let's talk about best idea you've executed and the worst idea you've executed and your biggest learning from that.
Got it. The best idea that I've executed, that I've helped execute, was probably um, I was program manager for this event, this regular program that we had called Chat with the Chairman. And it was a video series that featured the government agency where I worked, the National Transportation's top agent. It was a video program that featured the chairman of the board, and it gave direct access um, to him by the employees. So during this 30-minute program, employees could literally write in questions and ask the chairman of the board anything that they wanted on any topic related to the operational objectives of the organization, or just any question that they had. And I was ultimately the conduit for that. It was an interview style program, and we had a small agency, so 450 or so employees were invited, and they asked the chairman of the board any questions, and we loved it. At first, there was some trepidation about the types of questions that would come out because these were going to be answered in real time, but it was really a great avenue to build and increase employee engagement and really create that sense of transparency within the executive office and help people, in my opinion, stay engaged and productive. The second part of your question, Sarah asked, was about any misses. And let me have to think about that in terms of things that maybe we would do differently, or things that we,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, I'll be honest with you. When we first started the program, we had some technology challenges. Um, the bandwidth wasn't necessarily as strong as we had. So when we would kind of run these programs, people on the other end very frequently said, "Hey, it's kind of fuzzy, and I'm looking at it through my computer, and I can't really hear, and the audio is great, wasn't great." So I think one of the things that we learned is if you're going to, produce some sort of program, or you're going to go down introduce some kind of new tool that you think is going to help you connect with your audience, really prepare and test out the technology. In our later shows, we ended up moving to a conference room instead of an office to produce the show, because in the conference room, we realized we had better bandwidth, and a lot of the logistics involved in transmitting the video and audio feed um, were eliminated. The problems that were involved were eliminated when we had it in the conference room. So one of the things that if you have a great idea, or you're introducing new technology into a system that you're going to try to marry with some sort of great internal communications idea, make sure that you're comfortable and that you troubleshoot the technology before you go down that endeavor.
Yeah. And that again, you would think that's so common, but we're running from thing to thing to thing. So you just hop in and you're right. It's like, "Ugh, why didn't I not test this?" I think your answer is so interesting because I think it's interesting that the best idea really played on your strengths. You had mentioned that you were a reporter. So I wonder if your interviewing style and you feeling comfortable and you feeling like you could provide a lot of value in maybe coaching the chairman on how he should speak kind of in that forum do you think that's maybe why you lean towards that? And what I'm getting at is I think internal communicators should think about, all right, if I'm going to get a quick win here, let's go to something that I know, but yet be aware of, all right, if I don't know the tech very well, let me get my IT team in here, make sure I at least spend a little bit more time on that area. I think that's interesting that you picked that one.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I mean, internal communicators have all sorts of talents, right? You might have a background in web design. You might have a background being a writer editor. You could really write a strong blog that really brings a story to life. Or in my case, as you mentioned, I was a news reporter, which is basically a fancy term for storyteller who gets paid, right? A news reporter. So when I was tasked with coming up with ideas and programs to really take the engagement at our agency to the next level, that's exactly what I did. I gravitated towards my strength. I said, you know what? Um, I'm a good interviewer, and I know how to describe a narrative and make it sound appealing. So let's come up with a program where, Mr. Chairman, you and I are on the stage, or on the platform, and we're taking live questions from people. And it really went well in terms of the content that we were able to create, and um, sort of that sort of idea. And I would encourage people to do that. Not everybody is comfortable on camera. Not everybody is, um, comfortable talking to a microphone. They might have stage fright. But if you are, try that. Use your skills and your interests to really differentiate yourself at your agency to come up with results. Or if you're a strong writer, right, come up with ideas to perhaps create a digital newsletter, or other things that really play to your strengths. So I think that's great advice, Sarah.
Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk about all the things that you were able to do. We get that question all the time, not only on how to keep that connection, but how to, have this formula for transparency with leadership and make it feel honest. And I think those 4 pillars provide such a great framework and just give us an extra shot of confidence. Now when we walk in that boardroom, we can say, all right, well, here are 4 things, and they can even mention this agency. I think it gives us sort of like a good foundation to stand on to go test and try some things and move our, take our internal comms to the next level. So I can't thank you enough.
Agreed. My pleasure, Sarah.
Well, there you have it, folks, the 4-pillar formula to provide transparency to your frontline workers. Michael has shared all this information in a handy guide that you can access at internalcommspro.com/show notes. Stay with us next week as our journey to uplevel your internal communications to pro level continues.
Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, is produced by the Internal Comms Pro Collective. And don't forget to visit www.internalcommspro.com/show notes for our free resource guides. Thank you for listening.